Greetings, Grammar Pelusians. I am here with Sali Tagliamonte from the University of Toronto, a linguist and self-described language detective. We just finished the main show where we talked about teen language and her thoughts on how AI might be affecting language. So if you haven't listened to that already, go back and check that out. But Sali, welcome to the Grammar Girl podcast.
Well, I had so much fun last time. I can't wait to hear what kind of questions you're going to ask me today.
Well, first I read that you got started by investigating the language of your grandparents' village. Is that right?
Boy, you do your research. So I used to think, Canadian English was the most boring dialect on the planet. But then I went to university and I was attracted to this course called dialectology. And the reason I was because whenever I went to my grandparents' house, my mother would walk in the door and then all of a sudden her voice would change. Her language would change. She would not sound like my mother anymore. And on top of that, my grandparents owned a country store and post office, and I would love to go and hang out there because everyone that came in the store or came to get the mail just had the most unusual way of speaking. And I was fascinated by why that would be true. Like, why do they say these things?
Like, what's an example of something they might have said?
Oh, expressions like, first she did, and g'day, g'day, eh? Everybody's saying, oh, g'day, g'day. So it's very weird. Or, lots of words that, I hadn't heard when I was growing up. My mother was a teacher, so she didn't sound like that when she was talking to her kids. But, all of a sudden she'd go into this like other way of talking and with her sisters and all like, ooh, it was different. I had not heard it before. So then when I saw this course, I thought, okay, well, maybe I'll be able to figure out what's going on. And it was like, really? There's a whole science that I can study the way people talk and sound different from one another. I was hooked. I did my first paper on the dialect of the variety spoken where my grandparents lived. And, 35 years later or so, I went there and I did field work and I partnered with a elderly gentleman who had collected materials from the area back in the 70s. And it's one of the many communities that are represented in my Ontario Dialects project today. If you had told me that back when I was a kid, that I would be studying Ontario dialects, I would have said, you've got to be crazy. I was so happy.
This project is huge. I mean, you've gathered millions and millions of words of conversation. Yeah. Talk more about the Ontario Dialect Project, in general. What is it and what is it aiming to accomplish?
Well, one day in class, I was telling my students a story. And the story was, I can't remember what, but the crux of the story that everybody should laugh was when I said, so then I got a soaker. And I noticed that no one in the class laughed. And then it occurred to me, do they know what a soaker is? And so I asked, does anybody know what a soaker is? Like, nobody knew. I was like, oh my. It's been right in front of my face all along. I was speaking a dialect that they didn't understand. I mean, it wasn't like they couldn't understand what I was saying, but they didn't understand the word. A soaker, some people think, oh yeah, it's like one of those guns. You just soak everybody. Ah.
That's what I thought.
Other people think it's like a quality of a diaper that a child is wearing. Ah. But in my dialect, it is what happens when you put your feet in the snow and you get your feet all wet because there's a lot of water and your boots are for snow, not water, and you get a soaker. You get soaked. I mean, in other places in Ontario, it's called a booter because they wear more boots there. It really depends. But the point I'm making is that I suddenly realized that the reason I didn't think that Ontario dialects were interesting was because I was speaking one of them. And as you know, Mignon, if you are speaking a dialect, you have no idea that you have an accent or that you're using words that other people don't understand unless all of a sudden you realize they don't understand what I'm talking about. And at that moment, I decided that I had to go north from where I grew up and where I heard all those dialects originally to where my grandparents' farm and homestead was. And I started going around and doing my oral histories with people. And that was the beginning. And I've just kept going ever since because Ontario is a very large geographic area. And I didn't know whether there would be differences from one place to another because it's sparsely settled and they're like 200 or 300 kilometers. Oh, there's another word that you might not know. Uh, you know, 200 miles between places and nothing in between except bears and forest. And so, do people that are 800 miles away in a small place sound the same as people in Toronto? I needed to find out. And so, I gradually, over many years, I just kept going to different places. And so now we have 21 different places. And,
Wow.
you know, that's a lot of places. And I can do a lot of interesting work with that. But it's taken 25 years. It's
Yeah.
not like I did it overnight. And there are always people in my lab, and they're all busy transcribing these interviews and looking for interesting linguistic phenomena. And we keep finding interesting things. It doesn't, they just keep coming. And depending on what we hear and see and what we think is interesting, that's what we study.
What are some of your favorite findings?
Well, you were talking about the golly gosh and oh my God phenomenon. We had so much fun with that. And we recently did a big study on the expressions people use, like, I'm going to go see a man about a dog. And that means, I'm going to go have a pee in the bush. And
Oh,
then
I
that's
didn't know that.
that's that's another word like in Northern Ontario and Ontario, north of Toronto. If you want to talk about the forest, that's the bush. And it's not a little bush. It's like the wild expanse of the forest that you're talking about. So there's lots of things that I've kind of built up from observations from the material and also from my own experience being from the north myself. So there's an area of the north in Ontario where you have a lot of francophones, and in some places they represent the vast majority of the population. And so in these places, the Anglophones, the people who speak English, often have a distinct French quality to how they speak English. And here's an
Give
example.
me an
This is
example.
yes, this is what and this is my dad, right? You know that that guy Joe Blow? He lives down the street there in that blue house there. Every once in a while, I go down there and we talk about things there. And I'm like, that's a lot of theirs, Dad. What does that mean? And of course, there's a phenomenon in French where you put la at the end of sentences. Je connais, no? It's a discourse pragmatic marker. It means in English, there.
Huh.
Huh,
Oh,
right.
that's fascinating.
I
So,
know. And so I thought, I have to study this. No one has ever studied it before. So we
so
did.
when you say, look at that man there, it's essentially mimicking the way the French put the law on the end. Oh, I did not. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
And
That's
the
very
thing is,
cool.
it's part of English, right? We often do that. I know a man there, you
Yeah.
know.
I would never think of
Uh,
that as French.
but it's the abundance, it's the frequency, if it's the constant use of this marker at the end of a sentence, and you think, this is not really English. But it's very characteristic of the way people interact. And this is a more general thing. When you are in a community and the community has a particular way of saying things and doing things, if you want to sound like you're part of the community, you will appropriate those ways of speaking. And that's how you belong. It's how Canadian hockey players play for hockey teams in the United States, and they lose their Canadian raising and they lose their features that would identify them as Canadian, and they appropriate the ones that are more American.
Yeah. Is A, you mentioned that earlier, A, the Canadian A, is that
Yeah.
really a thing throughout Canada or is it more of a caricature?
Well, it's a caricature, that's true, but depending on where you live, it can be an accurate caricature or an inaccurate caricature. So if you live in the big cities, no, people don't do it. You know, if you come to Toronto, you probably won't hear it. But if you go about 200 miles north of Toronto, oh yeah, you will hear it a lot. So there's a lot of words that have a distinct urban-rural divide, just as there
Mhm.
are in the States. So,
Yeah.
you know, if you're in from a rural community, you're going to sound different than if you grew up in New York City, for example.
Yeah. Here's a feature you've worked on that now I'm wondering if maybe it has a French influence too, and it's the word the. So I have a friend who, when she tells a story, she will say, the father did this and the mother did that instead of,
Hmm.
her mother did this or his father did that. It's always the mother, the father.
Hmm.
And it
Hmm.
always stands out to me as odd. And you have researched that. Does that go back to a French influence as well, or is it something else?
Mignon, that is such a great idea. I've never spun my study of the possessive the in that way, but I certainly could in those communities that I've talked about that have a very balanced French and English. But what we did with the study was to look at the alternation between when do you say, you know, the cat and when do you say my cat, because they can be used in some cases very interchangeably. You know, situation, you're in the house, the phone rings, it's a landline, and, you know, the mother says, can you please get the phone?
Hmm.
Right? Or you could say, uh, it's a bad example because I wouldn't say get my phone, but you could, if I leave my cell phone on the table and I'm doing something elsewhere and my kids are at the table, I can say, can you pick up my phone? Or you could say, could you please answer the phone?
Hmm.
Right? So that's what we're looking at. When do people say, um, the boyfriend versus my boyfriend, or the husband versus my husband?
Yeah.
I don't like to get home too early when my husband has band practice, because the husband is like at band practice. Or I can say, I don't like to get home too early on Thursdays because my husband is practicing with his band.
Yeah.
So depending on how we present things, we can sometimes say the and sometimes say my.
Is
So
there a
that was
reason
what
that
I
people?
well, it's interesting because it has to do with communal possession. If something is communally possessed, like a landline in a phone in a house, it's a
Hmm.
communal possession. Anybody can use the phone. But if you
Hmm.
are talking about this phone,
Hmm. The cell
then
phone.
you're not likely to say the phone. You're likely to say my phone.
Hmm. Interesting.
So it really depends. And if something is more communally owned, like, you have a family car, can I take the car tonight, Dad?
Hmm.
It's the family car, but you could also, and Dad says, yeah, you can take my car. You know, Father thinks it
Hmm.
is owned by him, whereas kid thinks it's owned by the family.
Interesting. I wonder if my friend was thinking the mother and the father, or like everyone in the family's mother and father, when she would say the
That's
father
no,
says this.
I think that's probably a calque from French. I think in French you would always say le mère. Uh,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm
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 trying to
not good
remember. I
enough
think
in
my
French.
friend did take, I think French was her foreign language, but I'm not certain. So I'll
Well,
have to
I
ask
think
her.
this is a case where you would have to get out your own linguistic antennae and just ask her, see what she says.
I think I will, actually. So I
Good
want to go back
observation.
I actually want
Yeah,
to go
yeah.
back. I want to hear more about your Gosh and Golly study because I thought that one was really quite fun too.
Yeah, so in the north, there's a lot of colorful ways of talking about God. Um, so, in Toronto, everybody says, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." Even my 8-year-old grandson's like, "Oh my God, oh my God." It's like, oh. But so where did that come from, and what was there before? Well, profanity has also always been around. So we looked into that, But in the North, you don't necessarily, like, what are the G words that people use? So people know, you can say gosh, you can say golly. There are other words that start with G. They're euphemisms.
Mm-hmm.
So it used to
Gee
be that
willikers.
euphemism. Yeah, exactly. So, profanity was supposed to be bad, right? You're not supposed to take the name of the deity in vain. So it's called vain swearing. So you can't do that. So you have to find a euphemism, you know.
Yeah, I was surprised. I
Pick.
recently learned that that was considered actually more offensive than the other kinds of swearing, talking about bodies and stuff, that was the peak of offensiveness, which I didn't realize.
Yeah, so you have to be cautious. But the thing is, culture changes. So, and it was about World War II, that kind of a pivot where people started being able to say the word, oh God, rather than, oh golly.
Mhm.
And so people shifted from the euphemisms into the actual word, like, oh God, or, instead of saying, gosh, I hate it when blah, 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 you'd say, God, I hate it when. So, it's a bit of a shift from euphemism to actually using the word that you're not supposed to use. And then what happens is that, oh my God, takes off. It's kind of bleached of the deity
Mhm.
these days.
Yeah.
Certainly, I don't think my grandson means to talk about any deity when he says, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." But
Right.
for some people of certain beliefs and practices, it's quite offensive. So you don't want to use it. But there's an overwhelming upswing in the use of "Oh my God" as a emphatic expression, and
Is it
nobody says
mostly
"golly gee" anymore. That's kind of like
is
gone.
it mostly just an age thing now?
It's a very strongly correlated age development. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. Although
And
at this point, pretty much everybody says, "Oh my God."
yeah. In those 21 regions that you've looked at, are there golly regions and gosh regions, or is it just
Yeah,
sort of all everywhere?
the smaller place, the more far it is, the further it is from Toronto, the more you are likely to hear something like golly. I mean, it's so exciting for me when I'm out in the street and
Yeah.
someone says one of these words, right? Like Chesterfield. Have you ever heard it in the wild? I have,
I think I
come
have
on
a
in,
long time
Sally.
ago.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's like archaeology in language, right?
Yeah.
It's so exciting when you hear a word in the wild being used spontaneously that is probably pretty dead everywhere else. It's like
Yeah.
listening to someone and hearing them somebody say shan't,
Right. Yes.
right? Who says that?
Yeah.
Nobody. So Chesterfield has kind of gone the way of the dinosaur. But
But
unless you happen to go to some rural place, like keep your ears open when you stop at a little, gas station in somewhere off the beaten track, because you don't know what you're going to hear. At least make sure you listen to how the person greets you. How do they greet you?
what are some what
That's
are
a
some what are some greetings you might hear in northern Canada, northern Ontario?
well, you're not going to get hey, right? You're not going to
No?
get that.
No hay?
You might get things like "g'day," eh?
Mm.
Or
Fun.
"g'day," you
Good
know?
day.
Yeah,
So
"g'day."
Chesterfield, I think, leads us into your
Yeah.
work with the Oxford English Dictionary, because you were part of a project or an initiative to get more Canadian words into the Oxford English Dictionary, and wasn't Chesterfield one of them?
No, it was already
No,
there.
darn it.
But there were some that were not there. And the reason I got into this was I was in Japan one time, and the director of the Oxford English Dictionary was there, and he was giving this talk about all the Japanese words in the Oxford English Dictionary. And I'm like, yeah, but how about the Canadian words, please? Like, there are hardly any Canadian words. I can't remember how many there were at the time, but like pittance. Like there were like 5,000, I'm making up these numbers,
Okay.
5,000 Japanese words in the Oxford English Dictionary and Canadian words, 100. Yeah, come on,
No.
let's get some more Canadian words into the Oxford English Dictionary. So I wrote to him and I said, I saw you give this talk. I think I talked to him when I was there, and I said, we really need to have more Canadian words. He said, okay, well, you got to send them to me. And so then we started scraping through our material to try to find something that was uniquely Canadian or Ontarian. Well, that's hard because most of the vernacular vocabulary in Ontario is shared by, guess who? You guys in the States, right?
Right.
And especially in the South, you get lots of words that are very similar. So
Hmm.
finding words that were unique to Ontario was quite difficult. But not only did we add new Canadian words to the Oxford English Dictionary, we also had them change words that said Southern US.
Hmm.
And I kept saying, well, you can't just say they're Southern US because they're also Northern Ontario. So there's something wrong there.
So this, I
So
just
that
made a
was
little
another thing.
note to ask you about this. So
Yeah,
why is the Southern U.S. similar to Northern Ontario?
that is such a good question, Mignon. It is a great question. And it's because, and I'm doing some work right now with the director of the Linguistic Atlas in Lexington, Kentucky. She
Yeah.
is the director of the Linguistic Atlas there. And together we're showing that it is a misnomer to say many of these words are Southern because guess what? They're in Ontario too. So in actuality, we're looking at longitudinal commonality of the founding populations that went to North America from the UK.
Yeah. So is it just some settlers from the same place in the UK? Some of them ended up in the South and some of them ended up in Northern Ontario?
Yeah, so the fact that they share vocabulary just goes back to the roots, in fact.
Yeah.
So we are actually we're writing up a paper right now, myself and Alison Burkett, and it's the title is Presumed Southern.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the
Fascinating.
words that are uniquely Ontario, you probably want to know,
Yes, I
and
do. Yes.
one of them is the Muskoka chair, which is a similar chair to the Adirondack chair, but different in construction.
Oh,
Which is typical of certain areas of Northern Ontario. And another one is a gas bar. You know what a gas bar is?
no.
It is a gas station,
Oh.
but it's a gas
Just
bar.
drive up and get your car a drink.
Something like that. Give it some gas. But there are places where it says, gas bar. And
Oh,
it doesn't mean that you can get gas there and a drink. It means that you can get gas there because it's a gas bar. Yeah,
neat. What
yeah.
else?
Something like Bush that I thought was so quintessentially Northern Ontario. No,
Hmm.
it's also in the South. And camp, in Northern Ontario, a camp is the place you go to on the lake in the summer.
Oh,
Um, yeah,
would that be like a cottage or a cabin
exactly.
elsewhere?
Yep, yep, yeah.
Fun.
So
And
if you go to
soaker, we had soaker, right?
Soaker,
Hmm.
Side Road, I think, is another one. Just
Hmm.
very common words. And that's the thing, words are so common, right? Like telling the story about the soaker. Like words are so common that we do not know that we're using them and other people don't quite know what we mean. And there's nothing more quintessential Canadian than if I go someplace in the US and I say, "Where is the washroom?" And people
Hmm.
look at me like I am like crazy. What? And to me, I have to carefully, monitor how I'm saying things because in the US you would say
The bathroom
restroom or
or
the
bathroom. Yeah.
bathroom.
Yeah.
And in England, you certainly wouldn't say washroom because I'd get an equally weird reaction. You have to
Yeah.
say, where is the loo?
Yeah. I
Or,
would know what you meant though if you said washroom, but I grew up in the Seattle area, so it was close to Canada.
so see,
Yeah.
you would have more of a predisposition to understanding us weird Canadians. So if you're
Yeah.
exposed to other people's accents, you tend to have a broader range of lexical items.
Yeah. Yeah, we would go to Victoria and Vancouver for vacation and things like that. Beautiful, beautiful places.
It's probably what's made you a linguist in your own right.
Maybe,
Uh-huh.
maybe. So how many words did you end up submitting or getting in
Oh,
to the
we
OED?
submitted a lot, and we had
Yeah.
three categories. One, they are in the dictionary, but we have a meaning that is not in the dictionary. We had two. The second criteria was it's in the dictionary, but you are referring to it as U.S. Southern, but hey, it's here in Ontario. And third, it was the rare items that truly were unique to Ontario. And they're not that many
Mhm.
because you don't make up, most of our vocabulary comes from a long time ago. But there are some unique ones like Nipigon nylons, for example.
What are those?
Well, there's a place in northern Ontario called Nipigon, and it's very cold up there, and people wear these special kind of socks that are kind of work socks. They're gray and white, and they have two red bands around the top. Those are
Huh,
Nipigon nylons.
how fun. Okay, well, let's get to your book recommendations.
Well, it was a hard question for me. You know, I don't read very much. I read for a living. So
Yeah.
the last thing I want to do is read when I get a finished work at night. But I came up with three books that I would say were influential for me.
Yeah, and that's what we're looking for, something that remember from your childhood or that you would recommend to a friend. Honestly, this is like a gift list that a lot of people use to try to decide
Yeah.
what books to buy.
Well, my first one I'm going to tell you about was a book that captivated my attention when I was first starting to write. And that book is Jonathan Livingston Seagull by Richard Bach.
Mm.
And it's a short little book. You could read it in an hour, I think, and it's just a beautiful allegory that sits with you and kind of gives you a good feeling inside.
I've heard of it, but I don't know what it's actually about.
Well, I recommend it to you for opening up the mind to possibility.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, tempting. What else?
Now, my second choice, I did have to think about it a little. And again, it's something that was very impressionable in my youth and continues to be as I learn the craft of short story writing. And that is, you got to read people who write short stories. And for me, the best short storyteller is Alice Munro,
Mm.
winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature, who's been a controversial figure recently. But her books are fabulous. And if you wanted to take a look at those short stories, you can read them in, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. I would suggest Lives of Girls and Women.
That's great. I love a book that you can finish quickly. I mean, most of the things
Yeah,
people recommend are long, and this is a way to sort of jump in and read something that someone loved that isn't going to take you, a week.
exactly. And, I used to think short stories, I really wanted a big, thick book, but short stories can really go zingo, zingo. There's something in there that can really make you think.
Yes. Okay. And what's your third recommendation?
So here's my third recommendation. I said I never read, but I was a little bit of a white lie. What I love to read for relaxation are cookbooks.
Yes.
Yes, right?
Yes.
And
I love them too.
I I don't really like cooking, but I'm going to tell you that there's nothing like the cookbook called Love Real Food, and it's by Catherine Taylor, who many of your listeners might know as Cookie and Kate.
Ah,
And she's got a fabulous website, but there's nothing like having her book in your hand and you just flip through it, and that doesn't require a lot of time either. So there you go.
I love
That's
that. That's great. I love a good cookbook, and it's inspired. Even if you don't cook or you don't cook a lot of things from the book, I love reading them and imagining that I will.
exactly, and then you have them in your head for when you're in your kitchen and what am I gonna make tonight or today or whatever.
Thank you so much for being here.
Mhm.
Where can people find you if they want to learn more about your work?
I'm easy to find. You just Google my name. There's not that many Sali Tagliamontes around.
Great. And it's SaliTagliamonte. Sali Tagliamonte. Thanks again.